lecture in Archaeology and Art. This special public lecture was established in 2014 to honour the commitment and contributions of Emeritus Professor Vincent Megaw and his wife, the late Dr. Ruth Megaw, to their contributions to archaeology at Flinders and also to the Flinders University Art Museum. The lecture is also supported by some high-level areas of the university, including the Office of the Vice-Chancellor and the College of Humanities, Arts and the Social Sciences. Our college is extremely pleased to continue the relationship with the Art Museum, who also co-sponsor this event. And the Art Museum, continues their amazing works, and I'd encourage you to see the current exhibition by the renowned Yolngu artist Banduk, which is located in the Flinders University Hub at the moment, if you're on campus. There's also some special attendees I would like to acknowledge, including Emeritus Professor Vincent Megaw, Elder Lewis O'Brien, who I'll introduce shortly, Professor Vanessa Lem, our new Vice President and Executive Dean of the new college at Flinders, and also Professor Peter Monteith, who's the Dean of Research in our college as well. And last but not least is Fiona Salmon, who's the Director of the amazing Art Museum. So tonight we are very privileged to have Professor Thomas Stöllner present on the topic of identity and memory, approaches to understanding the early Celts of the first millennium. A bit of a personal story. I first met Thomas about 18 years ago, and he was in Australia visiting Vincent as part of ongoing research collaborations, during which time we went on a research trip to the Flinders Ranges to assist a friend with her fieldwork. One evening, whilst returning from fieldwork, our friend's car broke down on the highway to Paratuna, and we ended up walking in the dark, ultimately hitchhiking a ride with some talc miners to the pub, where we had to call a tow for our friends. So we thought we'd drawn the short straw, walking in the dark, but in the end we ended up in the pub all evening. So it wasn't that bad. And that was before mobile phones, obviously. Anyway, the rest of that story is another time. However, in relation to Thomas and Vincent, I'd also especially like to welcome the former Flinders students who are here this evening. It's great to see some old faces who worked with Thomas and Vincent both in Australia and in Austria at the Dürrnberg. A little bit about Thomas. He holds the chair for pre- and proto-history at the Ruhr-University of Bochum in Germany and directs the Department of Mining Archaeology, also at Bochum. Since 2014, he has been the head of research department there as well, and is a member of the directorate as well as many other amazing high-level roles. His research is centred on the social and economic development of mining communities through pre- and proto-history, with a focus on the archaeometry of mining, the archaeology of technology and societal interrelations, aided by research on settlements and cemetery sites as well. His research spans Old World archaeology, including Central and East Europe, Central Asia, South America, and his field also includes the European Bronze Age and further aspects of the Iron Age. So he's not a light worker, as you can tell, so much, much more. But before we begin, we've got Uncle Lewis O'Brien to do a welcome on country, and also Vanessa is going to say a few words. Can we please welcome Elder Lewis O'Brien?
Maruichunga, Gana Mian and Wangani, Mani the Bundi Gani Yadana, Naibiriko, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku, Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do as ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. This year I decided to take up meditation. I realised it was better than sitting around doing nothing.
Thank you. Thank you, that's wonderful. It's also a privilege to invite our college's new Vice President, Vanessa Lem, to say a few words. She is a philosopher of international acclaim, has had academic appointments in Chile, Germany, USA. She's fluent in 5 languages and is an advocate for diversity and inclusion. So please welcome Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Amy. Distinguished guests, all my first words are those of immense thanks to Elder Lewis O'Brien for such an inspiring and funny welcome to country. It's my deep appreciation that I too acknowledge that we are respectfully gathered on the traditional land of the Ghana people. I'm delighted to be attending my first Ruth and Vincent Megaw annual lecture in Archaeology and Art, a very special Flinders University event, which is now in its 4th year. As Amy already mentioned, the series was established to honor Emeritus Professor Vincent Megaw and his late wife, Ruth Megaw. Professor Megaw is an internationally acclaimed archaeologist and an expert on early Celtic art. He has played a pivotal role in establishing the university as an epicenter in Australia for the study of archaeology and for building our world-renowned repository of Indigenous art at our Flinders University Art Museum. Professor Megaw's passion for archaeology has influenced and is reflected in our world-class archaeology department. I should probably not be saying department, but, let's go for it. Indeed, Flinders is dedicated to fostering the best and brightest minds across a diverse range of disciplines. We are at the front line of imagining the future, for exploring the past, and for making the connection between the two. This series forms part of our thought leadership in the area of archaeology and art, including how our learnings from the past can help to understand and change the future. We are immensely privileged to be hosting a foremost international expert on Celtic art, Professor Thomas Stöllner, and I'm very much looking forward to his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's over to you, Thomas.
That it comes so quick. Yeah, so dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Vincent, it's a big honor to be here again after 18 years. I hope I will not disappoint you in your meditation time when I'm talking now about Central European stuff, about the Celts. But many of you here are here today, whom I know from a long time now, and I'm very pleased, I have to say, to come along again with these old friends, to be here and to talk to you. Hope I will be in the 40 minutes, try to do. And hope you have your classes filled to stand the boring theoretical thoughts I'm issuing and uttering now. So, let us talk about a little bit of identity and memory, and I could also call it approaches to understanding the early Celtic art, or whatever, the early Celts in the 1st millennium BCE. If archaeologists think about objects, the typological aspects and the distributions, they often consider, sorry, I do that a bit more, chronological aspects, the techniques of the production, or their embeddedness to ritual or economic spheres. They build upon their observations, even a historical dimension, as many recent transfer and migrations, economy and exchange, as well as mobility and social complexity. Object studies also apply to well-known keywords, such as memory or identity, both very important aspects to tie a society together. Can artwork and artifacts indicate if the members of a community shared and expressed their values with it? If someone comes from an indigenous Australian background, it is not difficult to understand such interwovenness of perceptions and visual expressions, but it's much harder for that cultures whose spirits have faded away already since a long time. However, interpretation that looks behind the curtain of visual expression enhances basic problems, while our arguments are based on artifacts rather than on people. All the motivations and archaeological filters lay between us and the prehistoric practices and actions in order to do an interpretation. Hopefully this works. Oh, no, yeah, here. As we use our object as explanatory folly to argue for processes in the past, it is quite problematic to use such models for the explanation, vice versa. It's being far from a solution here. I just want to argue with the French sociologist Émile Durkheim that a society orders the world of things on the pattern of the structure that prevails in the social world of its people. But how far can we go within our daily practice in archaeology? What has to be regarded as fluid? What is stable in regard of how societies did approach about objects as part of their daily life and mental constructions? In fact, we are facing always hybridity. This is, I think, very important. Hybridity in our objects that express a strange combination, an ununderstood combination of ideas from the people's world. But how to decipher their ideological background? Objects display neither a formal language nor a pure semiotic system. Celtic art. One of the heart pieces of Vincent and Ruth may provide insight into such processes, as its creation may be understood as a deliberate process that possibly inherited an ideological concept. Such a concept could be argued as a background to establish an overarching self-awareness and feeling of a belonging together. It had been argued for the early Latin style as being the first expression of such a concept, but others had doubted this with other arguments, which I do not believe. What is Celtic at the beginning is, though, very hard to say, and all that had been uttered in this direction came from a retrospective view. We are still far away from a firm understanding of the narratives that formed the background ideological concepts of what we now call the Latin styles. Ludwig Pauli, a famous German scholar, argued with others in direction of new religion or new religious ideas that was kept by a special group of initiated people that later were called Druids. But how to bring such hypotheses to a more attestable basis? We could keep in mind that the first important step on this way is to identify concepts at all. In doing so, one might ask if Latin art inherited displays of convention that stayed relatively stable over a long time, or if artistic expressions were volatile and individualized. Needless to say that the latter was never the case, although Latin art seems so dynamic and expressive at the first glance. One may bemoan this conventional character of Latin art, but it opens up a new perspective to find clues for an interpretation. Understanding if social value was expressed by artwork, we first of all might ask in which context such artwork was presented and how it was transmitted to a consumer group and how commemoration practice worked with it. As complex this may seem at the first glance, it is worth looking at two aspects that are important to understand commemorative practice as a source of identity at all. First, it is the embedding of foreignness to the own world, something that always was done, especially by Iron Age communities, when dealing with the Mediterranean South. So I take just a small glimpse to the Kleinaspergle. So one could ask, if you look at this combination of the Stöllner and the big flagon, you could ask, what was chosen? What was being rejected? And how was the practice of commemoration in those societies by choosing special spots? Maurice Halbwachs, a French sociologist, emphasized the fact that memory, first of all, was bound to performative practices like feasting, mourning, and later also after the practices were given up, was transmitted to plays, to lieux de mémoire, on which already a revised memory was kept over a long time. I took the Anzac Memorial, you may apologize me, but I found it good for Australia. Both was interrelated, the acting and the plays. So let me go now into the aspects of collective memories. First, before I discuss some objects, sites, and regions in which we can find traces of such. So let us go first for collective memories and its impact on identity, on objects in place of mnemonics. You also will apologize me or do a little bit theoretical thoughts in the beginning, then we go more to the interesting stuff. So going to the foreignness and the constant reassessment of goods, and I rely here on a concept of Igor Kopytov. If dealing with objects, it is by no doubt helpful to understand more about the biographical life cycle of those objects. It is the life cycle that includes the production, but also the consumption of, with various aspects that charges the idea of an object. Something that is connected also with a certain memoration. It is the special query, for instance, where the material came from, but it's also the formal and colorful imagination of the object that once had been made by a famous craftsperson. And it is perhaps also the foreign origin or the line of hands through which the item went that led to a specific storyboard that was memorized. The life cycle of an object is certainly a part of its complex social agency that it has within the cultural perceptions of things within society. Igor Kopytov has stressed nearly 30 years ago a famous example, the slave example as he called it. A person can be a slave and can get a property, a thing, by commoditization, and vice versa, a social being within a household again, for in a lower rank. By adoption, there is constant redefinition and re-embedding into the social system. What Kopytov's observation does make so worthy for us, it is a fluid system of cultural perception that could change in space and time quite often. What was once a pure commodity got by certain practice something else, and vice versa. For instance, if foreign objects of a certain shape, story, and quality became a desirable and prestigious good. So you see here the Klein Aspergle bowl. It had been brought into, of course, as a commodity perhaps, but then reused as a good, perhaps smashed, repaired, got a new value, and so on and so forth. So we have all these stories behind the objects we have to consider. Let's go to another point, to commemorative practices in the Iron Age society of Central Europe. In order to understand the way in which special goods and ideas were embedded to the Iron Age society, it is helpful to encounter the different ways of interaction between humans, their memories, and the materialized mnemonics. So you could call these anchors of memories. Marcel Proust described it impressively nearly 100 years ago in his famous book, À la recherche du temps, and he brought all the points like human senses, visual, auditory, haptic, olfactory, all these things contribute to the mnemonic. They are embodied by various experiences and practices of individuals and groups. Embodied experiences and practices are therefore often more implicit and bound to the memories of an individual rather than declarative memory that we found in representative remains like architecture and monuments, inscriptions of official feastings, for instance, and others. The flow of information is more formulary and explicit in such cases and will be shared and rememorized by larger groups. Such a declarative memorization can be highly conscious practice that not only helps the persistence of memory, but also allows the opposite, the forgetting. I think this is important. You see it on this example from the Stalin period. You see the one commissar is vanishing here. And of course, a very interesting fact, yeah, and you have this always. If materiality contributes to the evocation of social memory of any kind, it would be to be expected that the hiding and the depositing of materials also contributes to the forgetting. So we have this very often in our archaeological records, deposits of material somewhere. So has it to do also with the forgetting, one can ask. The cultural history of humans has many examples of active forgetting, of which the damnatio memoriae is perhaps only a famous one. Objects in our case can be understood as means to mobilize memory, particularly also autobiographical memory or meta-narrative and many others more. It therefore may be important to ask for the processes of memorization in which value-added goods were integrated by our Iron Age communities. So first of all, there are fears of memorization that may be described for the Hallstatt and Latein society north of the Alps. It is the funerary rites and their reenactment practices that can be held as the most important ones. Reenactment, for instance, by reopening the graves, by taking out removal of bones and such more. So we call this normally grave robbery, but only a foolish would call this any longer a grave robbery. Although we only seldom know about the whole funeral ceremony, we have indications of a several-step process of harnessing the tomb and the body, of displaying the death, the commemorative feasts during the funerals, as well as all the practices after the burial. This probably also includes the reopening, as I have said, the manipulation of the corpses, also the manipulation of the funerary equipment afterwards, what perhaps sheds a light to so-called grave robbery as a common but not sufficient and convincing explained phenomenon. Graves and the information about funerals are indeed the most important source we deal with to describe memorization spheres in Central European Iron Age. In this phase, we miss the evidence that precious goods were on display in special locations, not to speak about the practices in which they were involved. So we have only the graves, we have the last spot where they have been deposited. But what we don't know, where these pieces were before. For instance, here the famous Cratère de Vix. Yeah, so you could imagine that this one was perhaps put into display in this very famous so-called Palais de Princesse de Vix, so yeah, very fancy name, on the top of the Mont Lassois in Burgundy. So we know all that our ideas about contextualization, the spheres, find its limitation by our archaeological record. If you have a closer look to processes of memory appropriation, then it is worth starting with places of memorialization that show materialist memories in a conscious and explicit way. For instance, like these temenos of the area of Vix as they in Burgundy, or a ditch system around the Glauberg, we come to it later on. This provides some ideas, perhaps a special space that was produced in order to do the memorization. It is, by the way, of interest to recognize that, to see how this was going on, for instance, in these areas. If you look, for instance, at the Glauberg stages, which are somehow based in which such a ditch system, you see it here, famous Glaubi, Vincent knows very well by visiting quite often. So we see complexes like these spaces that were created bring us not only to the area of memorization, but also bring us to the stages. When we look at the stage, we do see that the hybridity aspects are here in a special composition. Yeah, this is not a Mediterranean stager. It is also not a purely Celtic stager. It's a hybridity of things that had been put together for a certain spot, for a certain memorization at a certain time. So when looking to the princely tombs, you see here grave 1. When looking to the princely tombs of the Glauberg, it seems clear that the monument displays a strong message to the visitor and puts the iconological system related to Tomb 1 in a line with this message. So we have this relation between the grave, with the stature, with the precinct here, with the ditch system, and all together performs a massive idea, a message that had been uttered by the community. It differs widely from any short-term embodied performances that was with the burial practice itself. This would have needed a continuous refashioning and revision if the memory should have endured. So Halbwachs was especially pointing to that point. So if you want to endure, you need such displays to do it. Coming to another point, from now to certain pieces. You see again here the precinct where it's now. You could imagine all the stages were there in the display. It was not only one, there were 5 in fact, or 4 or 5, and perhaps they were there in a special display. So, but now coming to objects. We're talking about objects and special anchors of memory, the mnemonics. So I start with one very interesting group, with the so-called beaked flagons. In the Central European Iron Age, I think there is no better way to understand the practice that people had with artistic goods than to look on the objects themselves. And I took the beaked flagon because they are one of the best ones to do so. Beaked flagons, either Etruscan ones, but even more their early Latin counterparts, are a good example to understand this commemoration practice and identity. It was the deliberate use of a spouted vessel from a southern origin and the visual imagination of the figural art that has determined the selection out of a wide range of Etruscan and Italian bronze vessels. You have to imagine this is just one, or very few that have been chosen from the northern people to take. It is not the mere foreignness that has attracted. It was the act practice of the pouring that was wished. It must have been an important aspect of performance, either in a funeral ceremony or during the life of the owner. As these flagons are not very practicable at all, so you would not go for drinking with them. Yeah, you have to say that. Even not with the Etruscan ones, but not with the Celtic ones as well. So if they are not practicable, one should rather not think on a feasting equipment sensu stricto. Looking at the Latin beaked flagons, you see all the 5 or even 6, when you count the Bonham with it. There are by no doubt another focal point of the Megaw studies. We all know that. It is even interesting to look at some of the most noteworthy aspects of their design and making. It is interesting to note that all the 5 examples that we know came from secure fine circumstances, were made the same way. And the 6th one, known as the Bonham flagon, came from the art trade, resembles the same crafts tradition. Their making, but also their picture program, embed them clearly to the northern Alpine sphere. So you can see it on the making of the Dürrnberg flagon. The making is very specific. The craftsperson worked as they would have done with bronze crafts in their time. You see it here. It's really typical so-called thoracic work, as we call this. The blank sheet were driven over a model, and that the bottom blades was separately fixed on the bottom part. While the blank sheet making is different from the Etruscan ones, the upper cover blade wasn't managed alike. So it's also a hybrid combination of techniques. That's also interesting. All of them show a uniform iconographic pattern, a program at the handle attachment and at the cover blade. You see all of them, the most important one. It seems they all followed the same ideological concepts, or even better, the same narrative. This concept is different from the Etruscan ones, although some stimulation is obvious. We can consider this was a deliberate composition that recalls a Northern Alpine and Mediterranean hybridity that at the end created something completely new. If we look in detail to the figural composition, it is likely that the mythical narrative is meant when looking to the whole composition. I cannot go in detail to that, but there are dominating beings repeatedly shown at the handle and cover blade, often in a relation to creatures and beasts that they had seemingly calmed down. This can be seen best here at the Glauberg, but also at the Dürrnberg, and also here. So it's a very interesting idea as well, which is transported with them. But however these narratives acted and were transported to the people, they mirror a specific worldview that was understood over a long distance throughout Europe. 2 aspects were of special importance. It was the super-regional bond that may be transferred by migrant craftspeople. So you see all of them are distributed in whole Europe, as by migrant craftspersons and perhaps Druid schools, and the wish to express a common cultural memory that was understandable for larger communities. So you may argue against now and encounter the smallness of the objects. So it's very small, of course. You cannot see them very nicely from a far distance, which may relate them to objects with very special occasions when liquids, for instance, were put in them. But however, as the Glauberg, we stay with the Glauberg, as the Glauberg shows, The big flagon, the burial and the stages were linked together by a central imago, I would call it in Latin, imago or imagination of a supernatural being that tied them together. This ideological construction was displayed to the outside world by help of the burial precinct we have already talked about. By its walls and monumental entrance, it is, as Maurice Halbwachs has described it, it was not any longer necessary to be an initiated person, perhaps, or even to know all the transforming practices that were related to the burial of the possibly heroic person that was buried here under the tumulus, just to know generally. It now should become a lieu de mémoire. It is obviously was the intention to make the basic ideological concept remembered by everyone who came by. This does not apply to the tiny objects of the figural art. This is an interesting point. Either not on the flagon, because the flagon was buried, you couldn't see them anymore. Or many of the very small brooches, like those ones. Yeah. You can't see very tiny things. They certainly could not seen in detail only could seen by a small group of people, perhaps only at special occasions. But this perhaps was not the main thing at all. All the elements were not visible to various groups of the Glauberg community at the same time. This is interesting. There was certainly, what I would argue for, an inside and an outside. So there were people who being more initiated and others more could see it, others could see it not. But all seem represent in a general societal narrative, perhaps expressed by the precinct. However, have the big flagons once served similar to the monstrances that we know from the Catholic Church being carried around to pour out a tiny amount of spherical special liquid that bonded the people together. So like the Catholic are consuming, of course, the holy bread, the hostia. Was the burial one of these actions, of these acts, and should it be remembered later by further ceremonies and feasts at the precinct? We don't know. One might think on those further stages that have been evidenced, and this might be stood in a row like the Moai in the Easter Islands. So perhaps these statues have been built up during the time like the Moai. But what is interesting, as the broken pieces and the buried nearby statue does show, this had not last for a long time. So it is perhaps thinking about if at one stage all of them were destroyed, perhaps in a raid of we call a damnatio memoria. We see later that the Glauberg case is not the only example for such processes in the Celtic world, but it's an interesting, we should consider. Places like the Glauberg let us think that much of the figural art was related to special portions of the people at certain times. This especially gets apparent if we look at areas where the interwovenness of Latin art to a larger portion of the society gets tangible. And now I go to the Dürrnberg. Of course I have to go to the Dürrnberg when I'm talking here in Adelaide. One of these places of entanglement was certainly the Dürrnberg, a place of economy and social prosperity, especially during the 6th and the 4th century BC, but going down to the 1st century BC, so all along 500-600 years. Driven by the Wölfisol, the community of the Dürrnberg became a well-connected social amalgam, having integrated much of this in a very special way. The Dürrnberg has nothing lost from its extraction to ask such questions, and it is therefore no wonder why the Megaws, among others, always took it as a firm knot within the pilgrimages through the European Iron Age. Vincent, I guess that's right, isn't it? What interests us within our discussion is now how such an Iron Age community perceived its lives and developed special forms of commemoration. An initially relevant aspect is that we deal with a numerically quite considerable community. So we think about at least 1,000 people living there constantly. A community, for its everyday practice, was perfectly able to form special social narratives and furthermore, and was able to maintain a collective memory over a long period of time. At the Dürrnberg, processes of this nature are easily conceivable, although apparently highly complex. Cohabitation at such a place may have triggered many collective processes, so to distinguish it's very hard. However, research had already considered the imaginatively figurative fibula at the Dürrnberg, which indicate both creativity and a consciously reflected access to the world of magic. I would not dare to call it in another way, but it's a very fanciful combination we find there. Finds of this nature that rests within a communicative memory and offer reminiscence of ritual practice, because they are buried in graves, can also be suppressed and therefore be lost. This I want to express. The Dürrnberg mask fibula, for instance, disappear after 2 or 3 generations. So in the beginning of the 4th century, they disappear completely and left no echo in the world of artistic language. This is very surprising. Communication via imagery, practice over a long time period, was then suddenly abundant, obviously, and possibly replaced by new communication elements. Here we see, I guess, a similar phenomenon like we already have noticed with the destruction of the Glauberg statues. The sudden loss of materialized memory and perhaps also the shared ideological concepts bound to them. But there were other practices at the Dürrnbergs that were on maintenance. Objects and locations evoke memories as they triggered a special habit and practice with them. So there is an even truer for any part of the human body of the dead, especially when regarding the wide range of continuous burial practices with the dead body in the human societies. And this is especially true at the Dürrnberg. So this is the other side of the coin. At the Dürrnberg, other things continuing, like where the practicing with the dead was common. So the practicing continued all the time. There's a nearly no grave, I have to say, that does not show reopening, reburying, and manipulation of all kind. And to make this a little bit more clear, I go now to a graveyard, just a small glimpse, the Simon Bauernfeld burial group, which is perhaps of special interest in this case. There's a special grave group that had been excavated between 84 and 87. It's in the 19th, 20th century. There were 11 burials belonged to a special group of mostly male persons buried in single graves and equipped with nicely decorated dagger. It's from the Hallstatt period, so 6th century, beginning 4th, 5th century. Neither those were buried together or in relation, so these males always were single graves, which is unusual at the Dürrnberg, to other members of their kin, nor the burial custom was typical for 2 other of the Dürrnberg graves. It is obviously that not only grave manipulation, that we see there, did take place, but also the spirits were displayed and opened over some time. So we have indication that they were laid on the surface. This had been revealed by a careful re-evaluation of the burials. What really was amazing is the fact that the area was reused after 250 years by installing 3 Middle Latin graves, which we have here. Burials, all of which again bore signs of special treatment and commemoration. So I want to describe one of these to make it more apparent. It is the remarkable grave 257 that was discovered amidst the grave from the early Hallstatt period. The finding had already previously stood out as a circular cone arrangement could be seen. You can see it here, this cone, stone cone, so it was a very obvious thing. And by further excavation, it turned out to be a stone cone which was positioned on top of the burial chamber below. It was based on the lower part of the burial chamber. Excavation clarified the stratigraphic relation. The stone cone was obviously already erected during the construction of the burial chamber further down, before the entire context was filled with sediment debris and residual cultural layers. It should be noted that the construction and the shaft-shaped opening onto the grave was probably planned from the start. This opening was obviously in use over a longer time, as the deposition of 2 bowls and the beaker-shaped vessel has shown. So these were deposited later on into this cone. But this cone also provided access to the dead. This is important. During those practices, parts of the rib cage, so they go into and went to the rib cage and to the thoracic vertebral column, and the right upper arm had been removed. So there was a removal obviously of bones. And even more, grave goods did not seem to have been affected. So all the grave goods were there, as rich grave goods remained in the grave. But what makes this grave so exceptional is another point as well. Beside the ritual practices is the display of the funeral. One woman was buried beside another one, both with very nicely decorated chain girdles, all of them, one a cremation, one a inhumation grave. And this shows that there is two women being related to each other. One woman, and this is the more interesting one, the unshiny one, who was cremated but received similar goods. And what is interesting with that one, it has Sanseno, Tyrolean Fritz and Sanseno ceramic, and it has also a special astragalus that was put to the grave, which is very common in the Tyrol area, a ritual that puts these picked astragalus and the Sanseno together in ritual places. So it is symbolic that this is a foreigner, a female foreigner coming to the Dürrnberg, being somehow intermingled in, again, hybridity with perhaps a local woman. A particularly interesting aspect, however, is the ritual practice that characterizes these graves, even in the choice of its location. As was the case in the middle of the 6th century, a special group of people were buried here. Could this have been connected with a collective memory and the locality, one could ask? Was this a memorial site for persons with special significance for the mining community? Both grave groups, the Hallstatt one as well as the Middle Latin group, had been furnished with special item of social display, the daggers as well as the metal girdles. And you see they're especially here in that area, not so much in other parts of the Dürrnberg, especially here in that grave group. The fact that localities and objects of remembrance are frequently commemorated, especially then later on in the 3rd century, so it's in the Middle Latin, at the Dürrnberg, is interesting. It's the process that we maybe describe as a conscious memoration procedure with the help of well-known antiquities, and we have many cases for that. So old things, antiquities putting to younger graves. You see a Hallstatt axe within a very nice salt grave of the Middle Latin. And even the jug here, a spouted jug, a wooden jug, has a mounting of small Hallstatt-shaped tiny tins that resemble these objects to an older period. And another case I can show you is a Middle Latin wagon burial, 346. This burial shows again several connections to the Early Latin, not only because it's a grave mound, because it's a wagon grave, because it's somehow separated from the other, but especially because older objects were positioned there. So especially the figurative situla, which we only have in pieces, but this is a very important point because these situla not any longer, it's an Italian situla, had been used as a drinking vessel. It was only the scene that was of importance, the display of the figurative scene that the people were interested in and put it to the grave. So one would rather expect such a piece in a 5th century grave, but not in a 3rd century grave. Did these antiquities serve to recall the olden days of wealth and prosperity of the 5th century, certainly embodied that for the Dürrnberg? We don't know, but what makes clear is that a collective memory still was vivid that already existed in around 500, so it still was there around 200s of something like that. Memory and identity obviously could be kept in these communities over a long time. It is not surprising, but it's good to see for Iron Age. At the Dürrnberg, we are in the favorite position to follow commemoration processes on the sound basis over several hundreds of years. It is comparatively easy to assume this also shaped a community in a local and even regional frame. So, I'm coming now to the last point. Hopefully you're not too thirsty now already. The forgotten bodies and the beginning of the Waldalgesheim, I would call this, and I called it again a damnatio memoria. In the earliest phases of Latin art, we often see something like a declared memory, obviously visible. So it's very obvious what we see in the display of the artwork. As we already have noticed, such objects were usually connected with conscious practice. If we look to special objects of the Waldalgesheim period, so which comes afterwards, this is something around the mid of the 4th century and later on. This is different. The decoration of the objects now seem the opposite. The vegetal style, or style végétal, as known first in France, now dominates, and more than that, regions and sites having held a dominant position in crafts and art production before are now not any longer centers. Not the Dürrnberg, not the Glauberg, not the Middle Rhine region, and not the others. At the first glance, this comes to us as a complete disruption of all the older traditions. Often we tend to understand these changes within our material sequences, our objects and their styles as ruptures and breaks of transitions. But is this really the case within the first century of Celtic history when tribes started to migrate in several parts of Europe? What tackles us is the fact that especially figurative art stopped rapidly or nearly at all. Otto Hermann Frey, a friend of both of us, always has tackled me with the question, where is it the Dürrnberg, the Latin Bake figurative art, where it has been survived? And I always had to say, no, there is not. So let us have now finally a look on that aspect, on the aspect of commemoration processes and identity of these groups involved. First of all, we have to say that figural art still did exist, but much more hidden as before. If looking at the famous grave of the Waldalgesheim, it's like the greening cat that laughs at us, yeah, of course, yeah, because we don't find the things. Sorry, come a little bit out. So first of all, yeah, the Cheshire cat that was how Jacobsthal described it, sitting behind the vegetal tendrils. So it's like what we're looking for, visible only for those who know what is there. So this is really important now for the Waldalgesheim. There is later on more and more again these figural art, but it is just only visible for those who know that they are there. Some of these tendrils, for instance, in the later Roissy-Mézec style, which is in the 3rd millennium, of course, Vincent has also written, and Ruth have also written about, even more boost again the figural aspect of the vegetal style again. As it seems again, it should be addressed more obvious to the viewers than during the pure Waldalgesheim phase at the beginning. And if we should look to other emblematic symbols like heraldic swords or dragons on swords, also that a hobby horse of Vincent, even their symbolic value was not forgotten, but even more formalized and spread all over Europe. So it's really fantastic how you can see the whole European area somehow being put together. However, what has happened to all the other ferocious beasts that we know from the early Latin that were so dominant and did populate the objects in the early style time? Did the termination of this picture world also lead to the end of the stories embodied to them? So let us argue this way. Commemoration does not only permit the memorization of actions, persons, and events, but also the opposite, deliberate oblivion. Just like conscious actions can trigger damatio memoria, we can also expect that the concealment, the reversal, or making invisible and deposit of mnemonic objects can contribute to the progress of forgetting. So if you look at the Glauberg stages, this becomes, I think, manifest when looking at their destroyed stages. So we only can speculate what and why this has happened at especially the 4th century. I would not wonder if this would, in concurrence with all the migrations that now affected the communities, to be successful in foreign lands, was certainly more appropriate not to insist on the old traditional rules or ritual powers, but more hide this under the glancing secrecy of swords, scabbards, and torques as the new symbols of powerful warrior groups. It would not be amazing if we once would find out that those persons leading the raids and migrations came from the same kin as the before buried within the monumentalized tumuli, but now using new ideas to convince their kin and tribe to follow them to new lands. It would be not amazing that especially new challenges enforced societies to find new expressions and memory anchors to express their identity. New and newly established rule had to be found, different from the older and often applied to the new lands. Coming to the end, is there a specific Celtic perception? One could ask. Despite the various processes of commemoration that can be now followed from the 5th century onwards in the early Celtic art, despite the fact that we see a lot of variability how identity and social bondage was expressed, there seems some overarching common ground that many groups shared from the beginning. There are clear commemorated IDs bound to special objects that shows intention to express. It is always first the linkage and transition to the supernatural. It's, I think, clear through all the time. It's always, second, the myths and narratives in various vestiges of style. And it's always the wish to hide all this information in the ornament. You see here the famous Münzing and Fibula. It's so tiny you can't see it, what the artist did between the tendrils. If you want, we can trace this idea to one common ground, possibly myths, in which a transmitting being was involved. This points to a common idea of the afterlife, perhaps, even if we have to accept that the forms to express the perception was different from the beginning. The principal idea still was vivid in all these centuries when the political and economic challenges of the Celtic migration period changed the conventions of the older elites in performing and displaying the groundbreaking myths of their world. What really makes us thinking is the long-lasting occurring persistence of certain motives and how it was displayed. It is not by chance that this was appreciated by all these groups, though we do not know if members of the tribes were able to perceive and understand them all along. It may well be that Celtic art was only something for some smaller groups within the groups and communities and tribes. But however we understand these social groups, either the Druids or memory holders, as reported by Caesar, or the elites who used those motives to spread common sense to their folk, these objects were amazing to all that looked at them, as they are still to us. Understanding them and the memories that went with them did perhaps embed the viewer to feel as a part of a larger identity. Feeling a part of it might have made the people of the Latin world different to the people of the South. It was more than that, I fear. We cannot answer if it was more than that, but we can start with speculative argumentation. However, finally, I want to express my gratitude to our old friend Vincent, who always gave me a feeling as being part of this initiated group of connoisseurs being infected and dedicated to the Latin world. Sorry, Vincent, I did more with mining, but whatever. I really hope that your main achievement, the supplement of the early Celtic art, will come to a printed treasure for all of us soon. I'm sure after spending much of your scientific life to all these elusive images of the forgotten world, we will earn much credit and use. Ruth, your beloved and late wife, always was saying and urging you, as I know, and I know she is much acclaiming from above, that you still follow both your way on this fascinating track. And I have to say, all the others here, thank you very much for your comradeship. And the Dürrnberg, Vincent with his camera, of course, all the time. But here we see a Dürrnberg farmer and Matthew Hansen, an indigenous mining of the Aboriginal community as a miner in the Dürrnberg. You see how they were attracted by the medieval entrances we excavated and many more other things. So thank you again, the Aussie Dürrnberg crew, and especially Vincent, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. It was really interesting to think about the human aspect of the identity and memory from the objects that we've, as students, looked upon a lot with Vincent. Thomas has agreed to take some questions, if there are any.
Oh, there are. Oh, please.
If you walked around Victoria
Victoria.
Oh, wait for the microphone.
Oh, hello, I'm Jen. Oh, I don't really need it, but okay. I'm Jan, so thank
Hi,
you
Jane.
very much. It was wonderful. If you went out to Victoria Square during the day and walked around, do you think you would find any of that memory in anything out there? Oh, I'm wondering.
Celtic memory, I mean?
Yeah. What do you think?
Good question. Do you think something has survived since the...
I
Vincent,
think
what do
there
you
would
think?
be
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, perhaps. You know,
It would be
If
a
it-
good quest.
it's, you know, the point is, it's always renewal of memory, and it's certainly not the same as it was before. It's always a renewal thing.
But there might be
Yeah,
just, you know how in some urban housing now, you see just a little replica of something that goes back to, not medieval, I'm trying to think of the era, but there is something on the new McMansions that are built.
Okay, you would
Just
like
over
to
the
know how much
portico.
Celtic the Aussies are. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay. This brings us to a complicated discussion. I have to say, even for me as an Austrian, not as an Australian. Yeah. Good question. How I would. The problem is starts with the British and their relation to the Celtic Europe. And Vincent really knows what I mean. You know, it's always a little bit like a magnet. They like each other or they don't like each other. You never know if they really like each other. You know, oh, are we descendants or are we not? Or are we related or are we not? And this brings, also the question what in the 19th, 18th, 16th, 17th century has been taken over on the old idea of historical record, what is Celtic in relation to the continent. And you could display this with the Brexit as well. But the problem is that there are also Celts at the continent. What you should now do with the EU when you're all related to each other? Also, I'm really puzzled by, because memory is so volatile, everybody takes what he likes to take. Which makes us, for us archaeologists, very puzzling, isn't it?
We're all related, isn't
Yeah, yeah.
At the end of the day, we are all related.
Yes, at the end we are all.
We all are.
But does this help us further in that discussion? Also, not really. No?
We are. Thomas.
Yeah, please, Gordon.
Well, the question is, when you think of the 60s in Paisley Patton, there's a collective memory there. You saw half of the designs that were going on, which we suddenly liked. So was that just a regression
No, it was
into
not.
our Celtic memory?
No, it was not. No.
No?
This last one I have
Well, we
designed
liked it.
to
Sorry.
make you all and myself happy. I had a lot of fun to do that, to be honest.
It's also easy to draw.
Yeah, okay. Okay, another
Yeah,
question.
thank you very much. This was really very interesting. My question is that you seem to assume that the disposition of the objects and the way you analyze what they mean and the memory effect was necessarily facing and in conversation with the society. Yeah? Let's call it the society of the living or those who will be posterior. But why not turn it completely around and rather say that it's possible that the disposition of objects and so on was facing the society of the dead, so to speak. Especially the way you end your lecture, which is myth, afterlife. There seems an assumption, that's what was interesting, that you cite Durkheim at the beginning, that religion or the afterlife is somehow functional to society, but one could also flip it around and say that the social and the social memory is in fact functional to something other, transcendent, so to speak, that consciously we have no access to. So how could you decide that?
No, we cannot. And of course, everything is a product of us at the end. The product of our construction. And also our afterlife is the product of our construction. An interesting point is when you go to the grave, of course, as you have said, many things which I have tried to outline at the Glauberg. You have the things which are interior in the grave, which perhaps are more directed to the afterlife or the persons who have seen them or somehow related with this transition process. They could see that. They could memorize it in a special way on that occasion. And perhaps a fourth being in the afterworld could also see it when they receive the people coming in, or the soul, or whatever they thought it might come in. We don't know. But interesting is we have also an outer part that we can see, which I have tried to argument with Maurice Halbwachs in a way that they used to establish places of memorization where they not all kept all the ideas of ferocious beasts. They did not know, after 2 generations, obviously they did not know which fibula this guy has on his glove when he was going to the next life, you know. But it is clear that some, at the Glauberg, for instance, it's very interesting, it's clear that they at least use some of these ideas being there in the stages. And it's interesting, it's not alike the same. It's similar, but not alike the same. So there is a difference between between information that some knew, and others they did not know, just perhaps should not know. So I do not know. You know, you can do a lot of speculation on that. But what I like to do is to confront them with the contexts. And really, as Vincent knows from the old studies, it was always done only on the objects. And we know with the old archaeology, not only with here in Europe, also in Australia, it was always done at the beginning with the objects. And you have forgotten on all these other displays. You could put the objects in, and as archaeologists, we have to do it this way, haven't we? Yes. Yeah. So, comrades of the world, unite. Yeah. Sorry.
Any final questions? You might have a chance to catch up with Thomas after.
Oh, yeah, don't worry.
Well,
There's a beer.
Thank you again to Thomas, and I just want to thank Melissa and the Office of Communication at Flinders for helping coordinate the event. That was very kind, and it's been a new structure, so we have gotten there in the end, so thank you very much. But before we conclude, we have a very special gift for you, Thomas, from the Art Museum by a well-known Aboriginal Yolngu artist, and it's a painting.
Very much.
So,
very much.
courtesy of Fiona.
So, thank you very much.
If we can thank Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I fear come again. Very nice. Amy.
There's water there.
Yeah, was it in time?
In time, perfect. You
Oh, worrying. My wife is always saying,
Are they going?
you're not
Yeah. No, I think it was right. No, you in there? That one's not going in. I'll just grab this one up. No, very good. It was enjoyable to see some of those images again. I haven't.
All the years.
I know.
Are we deleted? Was it needed?
And do you need it? Do you need the presentation?
I could send you a PDF.
Yes.
You could grab something you like.
Yeah, they put it on the Art Museum webpage, so they get the stream, but they might want this.
Yeah, no problem.
We get it after.
A lot of information in it, so it's...
You're such a baby!
Congratulations, my friend. That was very nice. Did you enjoy it? Yeah, absolutely. The sociology of religion at the beginning of it. I said, shit. No, but it's... So things like common sense is what it was so oriented beyond, rather than it was insignificant what the memory that they left of their generation would be. It seems to be, right? It's a kind of anti-Copernican. So we have the Copernican turn, so everything is relatively to us, to society, to subject. Now everybody's like, no, we're gonna move away from the Copernican turn. Yes. What's happening in philosophy?